At my husband's sister's engagement party, the name tag on my dress read, "The Help." His mother smiled sweetly. "You're just staff tonight, dear." No seat at the table, no dinner plate, no place for me. My husband Julian just chuckled and said, "The food is for family." I straightened my back, pulled my wedding ring from my finger, and told him, "In that case, I'm no longer yours." His smile disappeared, but that was just the start. Julian didn't realize I was home when he made the call to his mother from our bedroom. "Mom, you're right. She has to learn her place," he said, and I froze in the hallway, a basket of his laundry clutched in my hands. The Help name tag is a stroke of genius. After this, maybe Amelia will finally drop the pretense that her little consulting gig actually matters. He chuckled, a genuine cruel sound, as he imagined how his partners at the firm would get a kick out of seeing me brought down a peg at Clara's engagement party. I quietly set the laundry basket down, walked into my home office, and pulled out the file I'd labeled Contingency. Inside was 6 months of carefully documented evidence of Julian's embezzlement from his private equity firm. I had prayed I'd never have to open it. Now, as my husband plotted my public humiliation in the other room, I started drafting an anonymous whistleblower report to the SEC. Before we go any further, if you've ever felt small or been belittled by the very people who were supposed to lift you up, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. It costs nothing, and it helps us share more stories about finding strength and getting justice. Now let's get back to just how deep this betrayal really went. The laundry basket was full of his custom-tailored shirts. Every single one was ironed to his exact specifications, with a precise 1-inch band of starch in the collar. I'd been doing his laundry for 5 years, not because we were short on money for a service, but because Julian insisted it demonstrated proper wifely devotion. It was the same devotion that had me out of bed at 5:45 a.m. to brew his single-origin Ethiopian coffee while I was simultaneously reviewing the financials for a chain of struggling cafes I was in the middle of restructuring. He had no idea that while he was still asleep, I was pulling Boston-area businesses back from the brink of bankruptcy, negotiating with angry creditors, and building the financial models that decided whether families would keep their homes. Over the last 3 years, my home office had become my war room. 2 large monitors glowed with the spreadsheets for La Stella, a North End restaurant that was bleeding nearly $40,000 a month. The owner, Marco, had called me in tears last week, terrified he was about to lose the business his grandfather had built. I had already diagnosed the issues. His food costs were at 47%, a disaster when the industry standard is under 30%. 3 of his main suppliers were gouging him because no one had bothered to renegotiate their contracts in a decade. And his menu was completely out of touch with the neighborhood's shift from old Italian families to young professionals who wanted quick, high-quality lunch options. I was going to fix it all for a tiny fraction of what a major consulting firm would charge. But to my husband, this was just my little hobby. The contingency folder felt far heavier than it should have. 6 months ago, I'd started noticing irregularities in the files from Julian's home office. He'd become complacent, leaving documents from Meridian Equity Partners on his desk, assuming I was too absorbed in my little gig to comprehend sophisticated financial deals, but I understood them far better than he did. I saw the line items that didn't add up, the portfolio company expenses that were clearly personal luxuries, investor capital being funneled into shell accounts that I traced directly back to Julian. It was textbook embezzlement, hidden behind a wall of private equity jargon. I had photographed everything, made encrypted digital backups, and had a quiet meeting with Catherine Rourke, a formidable ex-federal prosecutor who now specialized in corporate malfeasance. "This is a federal crime," she'd stated, her voice flat. "When you decide you're ready, this will end his career." I had hoped that day would never arrive. I believed marriage was about protecting one another, even from their own worst mistakes. But apparently, marriage to Julian meant he could plot my public degradation while I was starching his collars. From the bedroom, his voice was perfectly clear. Clara's engagement party is going to be unforgettable. She's marrying into serious wealth with Ethan, and it's high time Amelia understood the gap between real power and her playing businesswoman. I could hear Eleanor's tinkling laugh through the phone. They went over the logistics. The name tag would be waiting for me at the check-in table. There would be no chair for me at their reserved table. They'd make sure the staff knew not to serve me any food. She did save your father's company, Eleanor conceded, but that doesn't make her one of us. Hired help is hired help, no matter how nicely they dress. 18 months ago, that hired help had been working 16-hour days to rescue Sterling Industries from total collapse. Harrison Sterling, Julian's father, had built his manufacturing company over 3 decades, but the pandemic had ripped open every vulnerability in their supply chain. The big-name consultants quoted them $400,000 for a preliminary assessment alone. I stepped in and restructured the entire operation for $150,000, pivoting their production line to make essential medical components when the market desperately needed them, renegotiating union contracts without a single strike, and identifying operational drains that were costing them $200,000 a month. I saved 200 jobs. Hard-working people with mortgages and kids in school kept their livelihoods because I understood logistics better than consultants who had never stepped onto a factory floor. Eleanor had visited the plant once during the restructuring. She'd wrinkled her nose at the break room where I was eating lunch with the floor supervisors. "These people," she'd said, not even trying to lower her voice, "this is all so beneath the Sterling name." Yet the Sterling name had only survived because I had single-handedly prevented its bankruptcy. The weekly Thursday dinners at Eleanor's Beacon Hill mansion had become an exercise in quiet endurance. Every week at 7 p.m. on the dot, I'd arrive with a homemade dessert, usually her favorite orange almond cake that took me 3 hours to get just right. She'd taste a small bite, pronounce it adequate, and then spend the rest of the meal subtly tearing me down. "Amelia is keeping herself occupied with her little consulting project," she'd tell her friends, putting heavy emphasis on little and project, as if I were a child running a lemonade stand. Meanwhile, my company, Apex Strategy Group, had just surpassed 7 figures in annual revenue. I built that company from my dining room table, fueled by $5,000 in personal savings and a desperation that left a metallic taste in my mouth. I made 50 cold calls to failing businesses. I got 49 rejections. The one yes came from a pizzeria owner named Giuseppe, and only because I offered the initial consultation for free. His daughter had rolled her eyes when I walked in, a young woman in a business suit, not the gray-haired man they were expecting. But the numbers didn't care about my gender or age. I slashed their costs by 35% without a drop in quality, modernized their point-of-sale system, and taught them how to use social media marketing, bringing in customers under 40 for the first time in their history. Giuseppe told everyone. His cousin who ran a steakhouse, the bakery down the street, a gastropub that was weeks from shutting its doors. Within 6 months, I had 8 clients. Within a year, I had to hire David Chen away from Deloitte because I couldn't keep up with the demand. Now I had 17 active restructuring projects and a waiting list of businesses eager to pay my premium rates for a chance at survival. But in Julian's world, success was Meridian Equity Partners, partner meetings in soaring glass towers, and leveraging other people's money to generate paper returns that didn't create anything tangible. My success, saving real businesses and protecting real jobs, was just a little project that kept me busy while he conducted real business. I saved the draft of the SEC complaint and opened a new file. This one was different. It was a clear, concise timeline of every fraudulent transaction, every falsified report, every investor he had deceived. Catherine Rourke would file this one. I had a private meeting with her scheduled for Monday morning if necessary. The party was on Saturday. By then, Julian would discover that some lessons can't be taught through humiliation. Some positions are earned through competence, integrity, and the quiet ability to dismantle someone using their own crimes as the blueprint. His call with his mother ended with promises of how amusing Saturday night was going to be. I closed my laptop and went back to the laundry, folding his shirts with the same meticulous precision I used for forensic accounting. Each fold was perfect. Each collar was perfect. The housekeeper was perfect. The name tag was meant to be his masterpiece of cruelty, but the SEC filing would be mine. 2 weeks later, on a bleak Tuesday afternoon that smelled of rain, Clara appeared at our townhouse unannounced. She was standing on the doorstep, mascara running down her face, her normally immaculate blonde hair thrown into a disheveled bun. She was wearing sweatpants and a Boston University hoodie, looking more like the student she'd been before Ethan Vance swept her into his world of tech startups and venture capital fantasies. "I think I'm making a huge mistake," she sobbed, and I quickly ushered her inside before any of the neighbors could witness a Sterling having a public breakdown. The last thing we needed was for word to get back to Eleanor that her youngest had shown weakness in public. We sat in the kitchen as I made her tea, real tea, with loose leaves in a porcelain pot, not the tea bags Julian considered good enough. Clara's engagement ring glittered under the kitchen lights, a 3-carat monster surrounded by a halo of smaller diamonds, the kind of ring designed to broadcast wealth from across a room. She twisted it on her finger as if it were scalding her. "Ethan wants to get married next month," she said, her voice tiny. "He says there's no reason to wait, that we should just get it done before his company goes public. He gets so angry when I suggest we wait until the spring." I kept my expression carefully neutral, but my consultant's brain was already firing on all cylinders. Ethan Vance's fintech startup was called Veridata Solutions, and it claimed to be revolutionizing payment processing for small businesses. Julian had mentioned it a couple of times, impressed by their growth projections, but the tremor in Clara's voice set off my internal alarms. "Tell me more about this anger," I said gently, pouring her tea. "It's not loud anger. It's more like pressure. Like when he gave me the prenup his lawyers drew up. It says I have to sign away all rights to his company, any future companies, and agree to a strict confidentiality clause about all his business affairs. When I asked if I could have my own lawyer look at it, he told me I was being overly dramatic. That night, long after Clara had left, I did what I do best. I dug in. On paper, Ethan's company looked spectacular. 2 million active users, 40% growth quarter over quarter, signed partnerships with 3 major banks. But I knew how to read what wasn't there. My contacts at those banks had never heard of Veridata Solutions. The user growth charts looked too perfect, too linear, lacking the natural ebbs and flows of genuine customer adoption. By the next morning, I had it. Ethan was faking his metrics to secure a massive Series B funding round. His 2 million users were mostly bots. The so-called banking partnerships were just non-binding letters of intent. His company was about 3 months from total collapse, and he was rushing to marry Clara to get his hands on her trust fund as a last-ditch emergency lifeline. I saved everything in a new secure folder, but telling Clara would require careful timing. She had to come to the conclusion on her own, or she would just get defensive. 3 days after Clara's visit, Eleanor called my cell phone directly. She never called Julian for money, she always called me. "Amelia, darling," she began, her tone syrupy, which always meant she wanted something expensive. There seems to have been a small hiccup with the estate taxes from Harrison's passing. Harrison had been gone for 2 years. The estate taxes had been settled long ago. "It's rather urgent," she pressed on. "A sum of $60,000 due by the end of the month. My divorce settlement is tied up in some dreadful legal red tape. You know how these things are. I knew perfectly well." The woman who had just posted photos from a luxury spa retreat on Instagram, who had bought a new Land Rover last month, and who wore a different Cartier watch to every single Thursday dinner, suddenly needed $60,000 for non-existent taxes. "Of course, Eleanor," I said smoothly. "Just send me the official notice from the IRS and I'll handle the payment directly." A beat of silence. Then, "Oh, it's far simpler if you just transfer the funds to my account. I'll take care of the paperwork from there." I agreed, transferred the money, and immediately engaged a forensic accountant through my firm. What he uncovered was stunning. During her divorce from Harrison's brother, William, Eleanor had concealed $2.5 million in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She had pleaded poverty in court, securing massive alimony payments while sitting on a fortune that should have been marital property. The $60,000 I had just sent her was likely for her next vacation, all while she played the part of a victim tangled in bureaucracy. In the meantime, Julian had become a ghost in our own home. 3 months ago, he'd bailed on our anniversary dinner, claiming a last-minute crisis with a portfolio company. I sat alone at a table at watching the candle burn down as the waiter studiously avoided looking at me with pity. For my birthday last month, he'd forgotten completely until his assistant sent him a reminder at 4 p.m. He sent flowers from the corner grocery store with a generic card, but it was the Friday meetings that told the real story. Every Friday for the past 3 months, Julian had an emergency partner meeting at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. He'd leave his phone in the car, insisting his partners required total, undivided focus. He'd come home late smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine, Chanel No. 5, expensive and unoriginal. There would be a faint smudge of lipstick on his collar that he'd failed to wipe away completely. His credit card statements, which I managed because he couldn't be bothered with administrative tasks, showed charges for room service for 2, champagne, and breakfast the next morning. I knew her name, Rachel Lansing, a senior associate at his firm, Harvard MBA, engaged to someone else, but apparently flexible when it came to fidelity. I had stills from the hotel's security footage, courtesy of a private investigator I'd hired. They were damning. I filed them away with the embezzlement evidence, methodically building my case while I played the part of the oblivious wife, too busy with her little business to notice. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a special courier, gold embossing on cream cardstock so heavy it could stand on its own. The honor of your presence is requested at the engagement celebration of Clara Elise Sterling and Ethan Vance. It was addressed only to Mr. Julian Sterling. Where's my name? I asked him at dinner that night, holding up the invitation. Julian barely looked up from his phone, where he was probably texting Rachel about their next Friday rendezvous. Mom probably just forgot to add your name. You know how she is with details. Eleanor Sterling had never forgotten a detail in her life. She could recall the thread count of her bed linens, the vintage of a wine she'd been served 3 years ago, and the precise cost of everyone's jewelry at any given event. This was not an oversight. It was a calculated exclusion. So, should I RSVP for 1 or for 2? I asked, testing him. Obviously, you're coming, he said, finally looking at me, his eyes filled with irritation that I had interrupted his digital flirtation. Just wear something understated. You know, you don't want to upstage the bride. Understated. As if I were the type to show up at his sister's engagement party dripping in sequins, desperate for the spotlight. As if my very existence needed to be toned down, made smaller, less significant. As if I needed to practice being invisible before they made it official with a name tag. That night, I stood in our walk-in closet staring at my clothes. The designer dresses he used to say made me look like I belonged. The power suits I wore to client meetings. The carefully curated wardrobe of a woman who was constantly trying to fit into a world that had already decided she was an outsider. I pulled out a simple, elegant, black dress, the kind of dress you could wear to a business dinner or a funeral. It would be perfect for what was coming. Saturday arrived with a crisp, late September chill in the air, the kind that makes you want a coat, but you know you'll look out of place. I stood in front of the mirror in our bedroom at 6:30 p.m. The black dress fit perfectly. My makeup was applied with the precision of someone preparing for a deposition, not a party. The exhaustion I saw in my own eyes was more than just from sleepless nights spent poring over spreadsheets. It was the bone-deep weariness that comes from trying to maintain a marriage that had become nothing more than a performance. Julian had left 2 hours earlier for pre-party drinks with a client, the kind of drinks that required a fresh shirt and a second application of cologne, even though he'd supposedly been at the office all day. He'd kissed my cheek distractedly and told me not to wait up, that he'd meet me there. I drove myself in my own car, a quiet Mercedes, winding through the elegant streets of Boston toward the venue. The car still smelled faintly of the leather conditioner Julian insisted on, another one of those tiny details that mattered more to him than whether his wife had an escort for the evening. At every stoplight, I checked my phone, confirming that David Chen had the encrypted files, that Catherine Rourke was on standby, and that my audio recording of the evening would be admissible if it came to that. The valet line at the Arboretum Hall was already a parade of cars that cost more than most people's homes. I pulled in between a white Bentley and a black Maserati, both likely belonging to Julian's partners, men who viewed marriage as a merger and a wife as either an asset or a liability on their social spreadsheet. The valet was young, maybe 22, clearly a student working his way through college. He took my keys with the deference reserved for people who looked like they belonged. Inside, the grand lobby was a sea of marble and ambition, the signature look of Boston's elite venues. I saw a group of Julian's colleagues by the bar and heard my name drift over. "That's the one who fancies herself a business consultant," one of them said, not quite quietly enough. "Julian lets her play CEO with that little company of hers." They all laughed, a sound as sharp and brittle as clinking champagne flutes. I walked right past them, my heels clicking on the marble with a steady, metronomic rhythm. Each step was controlled, deliberate, the walk of a woman who knew she belonged, even when every whisper in the room said she didn't. The check-in table was draped in ivory silk, staffed by a young woman in pearls that probably cost more than her month's rent. "Amelia Sterling," I said, my voice clear. She smiled and started to flip through the guest list on her tablet. The smile faltered. She scrolled again, her manicured finger tracing down the names. A third time, more slowly now. I watched a flush of pink creep up her neck. "I'm so sorry, could you spell the last name for me?" "Sterling. Sterling." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with genuine distress, then glanced at something hidden under the table. Her hand was trembling slightly as she reached for a single name tag, set apart from all the others. She pushed it across the marble counter just as Eleanor materialized at my side in a champagne-colored Chanel suit, her timing as impeccable as someone who had been watching for this very moment. The name tag, in elegant looping script, read, "Amelia the Help." "Oh, Amelia," Eleanor announced, her voice pitched to carry across the entire lobby. "You're just staff tonight, dear." The words hit the room like a gavel. Conversations died. Investment bankers turned from their drinks. Hedge fund managers paused their schmoozing. 300 of Boston's financial elite had just found their evening's entertainment, watching Eleanor Sterling publicly brand her daughter-in-law as hired help. Behind me, I heard someone whisper, "Isn't that the woman who saved Sterling Industries?" Another voice replied, "Apparently, she's the housekeeper now." Someone actually took a picture with their phone. I picked up the name tag and examined it as if it were a piece of evidence. The cardstock was thick and expensive. The printing was professional. This wasn't a mistake. This had been ordered, paid for, and deliberately kept separate from the real guest list. "Shall I show you to the service entrance?" Eleanor asked sweetly. "The staff usually comes in through the back." With steady hands, I clipped the badge to my black dress and walked into the ballroom. Table 3 was positioned for maximum public exposure, close to the head table to signify importance, but far enough from the doors to make a quiet exit impossible. 7 chairs were arranged around 8 place settings. The empty space where my chair should have been was a screaming void, more conspicuous than any announcement. The gap had been meticulously preserved. No one had dared to shift their chairs to close it. It was humiliation by design. I stood beside that empty space, feeling the eyes of the room on me. I watched Eleanor's friends notice the missing chair, then my name tag, and then exchange knowing, satisfied glances. The mayor's wife let out an audible gasp. A federal judge's husband discreetly pulled out his phone, no doubt texting the salacious gossip to his friends. Julian arrived 40 minutes later, and yes, I was still standing. He strode in with the overconfidence that comes from having had exactly 3 scotches. Enough for bravado, not enough to slur his words. His collar bore a faint coral pink lipstick stain he hadn't noticed. Rachel's shade, the scent of her Chanel number. 5 hung around him like a cloud of evidence. He saw me standing there. He saw the missing chair. He saw his mother's triumphant smile. He saw his partners from Meridian Equity watching from a nearby table. And he laughed. It wasn't a nervous chuckle or an uncomfortable titter. It was a genuine, amused laugh, as if someone had just delivered the perfect punchline. "Relax, Amelia," he said, reaching for the glass of wine that was already poured at his place. "The food is for family. 5 years of marriage, 3 years of building a company from nothing, 18 months since I had rescued his father's entire legacy from ruin. And I wasn't family enough for a chair, for a plate of food, for a shred of basic human dignity in front of the very people whose respect he so desperately craved. In that instant, I felt the crystal-clear moment of clarity that comes when a marriage dies. Not the slow, painful decay of love fading, but the sudden, sharp snap of realizing you were never truly loved in the first place. I had been an accessory that had become an inconvenience, a supporting character who had forgotten she wasn't supposed to have her own plot. I reached for my wedding ring, the 2-carat diamond Julian had picked out not to please me but to impress his partners. The metal was warm against my skin, a familiar weight after 5 years of never taking it off. I slid it off my finger, slowly and deliberately, letting the ballroom's chandeliers catch the facets of the diamond. The movement was a spotlight. Conversations at the tables around us sputtered out. Someone actually put down their fork. I placed the ring on the pristine white tablecloth. The soft click it made seemed to echo in the sudden silence, a sound that carried like a gunshot, silencing the room in an expanding ripple of shock. "In that case," I said, my voice clear and steady, "I'm no longer yours." Julian's laugh died in his throat. His face cycled through a series of emotions, confusion, then embarrassment, and then the dawning, horrified realization that I was not joking, that his wife had just publicly renounced their marriage in front of Boston's entire financial world, that the woman he'd branded the help had just quit. I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels marking a steady beat against the marble floor. Behind me, the room erupted into chaos. I could hear the scrape of chairs, the rise of voices, Eleanor's sharp command, "Julian, do something." But I didn't look back. 300 members of Boston's elite would remember this night. They would tell this story at their dinner parties for years to come. They would wonder what kind of man laughs while his wife is forced to stand without a chair. They thought they had just witnessed the grand finale. They were wrong. This was only the opening act. The parking garage at the Arboretum Hall was silent and cool after the chaos I'd left behind. My hands were perfectly steady on the steering wheel, steadier than they had been in months of pretending our life was normal. I pulled out my phone and made a call. David Chen picked up on the third ring, even though it was nearly 9 o'clock on a Saturday night. "Execute Project Retribution," I said without any preamble. There was a beat of silence, and then his voice, crisp and professional, came through. "Confirming execution of Project Retribution. Asset freeze protocols are now being initiated. Document preservation is complete. The SEC filing is prepared for submission on Monday morning. 6 months ago, I had sat in David's office with a banker's box filled with evidence. It contained copies of Julian's falsified reports, records of diverted funds, and flow charts tracing investor money into his personal accounts. David, who'd spent a decade at Deloitte before I recruited him, had reviewed every page with painstaking care. "This is prison time," he had said quietly. And that was the day we created Project Retribution, a comprehensive response plan for the day when Julian's betrayal finally became too much to bear. "The accounts will be frozen within the hour," David's voice continued in my ear. "Our forensic accountant has everything logged. Catherine Rourke has been briefed." I drove home through the quiet streets of Boston, past stately homes where normal families were having normal Saturday nights. No public humiliations, no degrading name tags, no missing chairs at the family table. The townhouse was dark when I got there. Julian obviously hadn't come home yet. He was probably still at the party, desperately trying to spin a narrative for his partners to explain why his wife had just staged a public separation at the social event of the season. I poured myself a single glass of wine and opened my laptop in the home office. The SEC's whistleblower portal loaded slowly, almost as if it were giving me one last chance to reconsider. I didn't need it. I uploaded each file, meticulously tagged: Meridian Fund 3 misallocation, personal expense fraud, falsified portfolio reports, 27 files in total. Each one was a nail in the coffin of the professional life Julian had built on lies. My phone started buzzing. Julian. I let it go to voicemail. It buzzed again and again. By the fifth call, I was curious enough to glance at the caller ID. It was a different number each time: his office line, his cell, his partner's conference room phone. By midnight, I had 17 missed calls. I finally listened to the voicemail he left after his 12th attempt. "Amelia, this is absurd. Whatever point you were trying to make, you've made it. Call me back." His voice was controlled, the condescending tone he used with difficult clients. The 13th message was different. "We need to discuss this like rational adults. You're being emotional. Let's just talk about what's bothering you." By the 16th message, the desperation was leaking through. "The partners are asking questions, Amelia. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're destroying everything we built. Everything we built." As if he had ever contributed anything to my company besides scorn. As if his embezzlement and his affairs were acts of building, not destroying. At 5:30 on Sunday morning, my doorbell rang. Catherine Rourke was standing on my doorstep, dressed in a flawless suit despite the early hour. She carried a leather briefcase that likely cost more than a month's rent in this neighborhood. She had driven straight from her home after David's call. "Let's review your arsenal," she said, spreading a series of manila folders across my dining room table as if she were dealing a hand in the world's highest stakes poker game. The first folder contained Julian's greatest hits of infidelity: the photos from the Fairmont Copley Plaza, time-stamped credit card receipts, and sworn affidavits from hotel staff who'd been paid to ignore his indiscretions. Rachel Lansing was featured prominently, but there were others. There was Jennifer from a business trip to Hong Kong, Maria from a conference in Miami. Each affair was documented with the cold precision of a prosecutor building an airtight case. "The infidelity clause in your prenuptial agreement is ironclad," Catherine explained, tapping a paragraph with her perfectly manicured nail. "It means full forfeiture of any claims to marital assets, plus damages for reputational harm. He gets nothing from your company, nothing from your personal accounts, and he will owe you compensation." The second folder was even more damning. It contained the fraudulent fund allocations from Meridian Equity, laid out in spreadsheets that were impossible to misinterpret. Investor money diverted for personal use, disguised as operating expenses for portfolio companies. "This is federal crime territory," Catherine said quietly. "Once the SEC receives this, the investigation will be unstoppable. His partners will cut him loose immediately. Criminal charges are almost certain." The third folder was my nuclear option. It detailed Eleanor's hidden offshore accounts, the $2.5 million she'd concealed in the Caymans during her divorce. "Her ex-husband's attorney will find this very interesting," Catherine noted with a thin smile. "The clawback provisions alone would bankrupt her. We spent hours going through every document, every strategy, every possible outcome. By the time she left at noon, the path forward was brutally, methodically clear. That evening, still Sunday, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but it had a local area code. I almost ignored it, but then decided to answer. "Amelia?" The voice was small and scared. "It's Clara. I'm in your building's lobby. Can I please come up?" 5 minutes later, she was at my door, looking completely broken. She was wearing pajama pants and her university sweatshirt, her face still streaked with old tears. In her hands, she clutched a stack of printed pages covered in highlighting and frantic notes. "I started researching Ethan's company," she whispered, her voice trembling. "After what you said about always checking the details, the numbers, they don't make any sense." I made her tea while she spread her research across my kitchen counter. She had done surprisingly good work for someone with no financial background. She'd found the impossible-looking user growth charts, the dead links for supposed corporate partners, the fake LinkedIn profiles for employees who didn't actually exist. "It's all a lie, isn't it?" she asked, looking at me with eyes that already knew the devastating answer. We sat on the floor of my kitchen, and for the first time, I told her everything. About Julian's affairs, his crimes, the plan to humiliate me at her party, while Mom was calling you the help. While Julian was laughing, she trailed off, fresh tears welling in her eyes. "You were the only one who was ever actually kind to me," I told her, and it was the truth. "When I married Julian, you were the only one who welcomed me. You never once made me feel like an outsider. You were the only one who acted like family. You were the one who acted like family," she whispered back. We talked late into the night, mapping out how she would confront Ethan and how she would protect herself legally and financially. I gave her Catherine Rourke's card and promised to cover all her legal fees. When she finally left, she hugged me with the desperate strength of someone who had just realized how utterly alone she had been in her own family. I stood in my silent townhouse afterward, surrounded by the evidence of calculated cruelty and systemic betrayal. Tomorrow, the documents would be filed, the accounts would be frozen, the investigations would begin. The Sterling family empire was about to begin its long, painful collapse. But tonight, in my kitchen with Clara, I had remembered why I was doing all of this. It wasn't just for revenge, though I knew that would be satisfying. It was because someone had to protect the people this family claimed to love while they were busy destroying them. Someone had to be the family they only pretended to be. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn air that made everything seem sharper and more defined. I was at my desk when the first domino fell at exactly 8 a.m. My phone buzzed with a voicemail from a number I knew well, Eleanor's private line. I put it on speaker as I sorted through my morning emails. "You vindictive little nobody." Her voice was a high-pitched, frantic shriek. "How could you? Do you have any idea what you've done? William's attorney just served me papers. They know about the Cayman accounts. They know everything." The message devolved into a 3-minute tirade, a chaotic mix of legal threats and desperate pleas. She used words I had never heard from her perfectly manicured Beacon Hill lips. The polished society matron had shattered, revealing the desperate con artist who had hidden $2.5 million while claiming she couldn't afford her legal bills. I deleted the voicemail just as an email from Catherine Rourke arrived. The subject line was simple: clawback initiated. William's lawyers had filed emergency motions that morning. Eleanor's accounts were frozen, and she was facing over $800,000 in penalties on top of the $2.5 million she had concealed. Her new Land Rover would be repossessed by the end of the week. At 9:15 a.m., my phone rang. It was David Chen calling from his car. "You need to see this," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "Check your email. Security footage from Meridian Equity just got leaked. The video was grainy, but the scene was unmistakable. It was Julian in his corner office at 7:43 that morning, reading something on his computer. His expression shifted from confusion to panic to pure rage in the span of 30 seconds. Then, He picked up his laptop and hurled it against the glass wall of his office with enough force to create a spiderweb of cracks. The sound of shattering electronics was followed by him screaming at his assistant to get his lawyer on the phone. But what the footage captured next was even more destructive. 3 junior analysts stood frozen in the hallway, their phones raised, recording their boss's complete and utter meltdown. Julian was screaming obscenities, throwing papers, trying and failing to call someone, probably me, and then throwing his phone against the wall when I didn't answer. "It's already gone viral," David said. #Sterling Meltdown. Every financial blog in Boston has it. By noon, the video had over 40,000 views. Someone had set it to classical music, which made Julian's tantrum look even more unhinged against the serene backdrop of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons. The comments were a bloodbath. Former employees shared horror stories about his temper. Competitors openly questioned his stability. Investors posted panicked questions about whether this was the man they were trusting with their life savings. I watched it once, pinpointing the exact moment the SEC's formal notice of investigation must have appeared on his screen. The moment he realized his career was over. The moment he realized that prison was a very real possibility. The moment his perfectly constructed world shattered just like his laptop screen. Wednesday brought its own unique form of karmic justice. Eleanor called me 6 times before noon, each message more unhinged than the last. I didn't answer, but Clara forwarded me the text their mother had sent to the family group chat. "The Boston Athletics Club has made a terrible error. Some confusion with my finances. This will be sorted out immediately." But there was no confusion. The exclusive club, where she had held court for 20 years, had suspended her membership indefinitely pending the resolution of her legal issues. Her Wednesday tennis partner, a woman who had been Eleanor's maid of honor, reportedly walked right past her in the lobby without a word of acknowledgement. Clara called me that afternoon, her voice a strange mix of shock and grim satisfaction. Mom showed up for her tennis match, and they had her locker cleared out. Her things were in a cardboard box in the lobby, she said. Security escorted her out. Everyone saw it. Mrs. Chen actually took a picture. The great Eleanor Sterling, reduced to carrying a cardboard box of tennis whites and designer athletic wear through a lobby full of people she had once deemed beneath her. The Boston Society columns would have a field day with this for months. Thursday, David arrived at my home office with a folder and a look on his face I had come to recognize as an opportunity. "The Arboretum Hall is in trouble," he said, spreading financial statements across my desk. "The venue is hemorrhaging cash. Terrible management, even worse, vendor contracts. They're quietly looking for a buyer before they have to declare bankruptcy." I looked at the numbers. The very same venue where I had been branded the help was now on the brink of collapse, begging for a lifeline. The irony was so perfect it was almost delicious. "How much?" I asked. "They're asking $2 million. They'll take $800,000 in cash, 40 cents on the dollar. We can run it through a shell corporation, make it an acquisition by Apex Strategy. $800,000 to own the site of my greatest humiliation, to control the very space where 300 people had watched me be degraded, to ensure that no one else would ever have to endure what I went through in that ballroom." "Draw up the papers," I said, without a moment's hesitation. David smiled, the kind of smile that reminded me why I'd hired him away from a top-tier firm. He understood that revenge, when done right, is just good business. "I've already started," he said. "We can close by the end of the month. It's a full transfer of assets, including all their existing event contracts. By the way, Eleanor's big charity gala is booked there for December." The charity gala. It was Eleanor's crown jewel, the event she planned all year to prove her social dominance by raising money for causes she barely understood. The invitations had already been sent, the deposits were paid, and soon I would own the venue. "We'll honor the existing contracts," I said carefully, "with a few modifications to our house policies." David raised an eyebrow. "Modifications?" "New rules," I clarified. "No demeaning name tags, no missing chairs, No class distinctions in service. Every single person who walks through those doors will be treated with equal dignity. As for Eleanor's gala, we'll let it proceed as planned. She'll just have to abide by the new policies. And perhaps we'll have the venue's new ownership displayed prominently, for transparency. That afternoon, I signed the initial acquisition papers, thinking about the name tag that still sat in my desk drawer, the one that read, Amelia, the Help. Soon I would own the building where that humiliation took place. I would control the space where Julian had laughed at my empty chair. I would be the one to decide who was welcome and who was not. The acquisition documents felt heavy, loaded with the promise of transformation. Under my ownership, the Arboretum Hall would become a place where respect wasn't determined by a person's bank account or their last name. It would be a place where no one would ever have to stand beside an empty chair while their spouse laughed at their expense. As David was gathering the papers, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it to find a message from Rachel Lansing, Julian's mistress. He's been calling me non-stop, begging for help. I thought you should know I'm testifying before the SEC tomorrow. I kept records of everything, the gifts, the trips, all paid for with investor funds. I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. Even his mistress was jumping ship. The dominoes weren't just falling anymore. They were in a state of cascading collapse, each one triggering the next with a beautiful, brutal precision. I stared at Rachel's text for a long moment. It was ironic that his mistress would ultimately show more integrity than he ever had. I then pulled up the emails for the 3 portfolio companies that Apex Strategy had contracts with, all originally sourced through Meridian Equity. The CEO of each of those companies owed their survival to my restructuring work, though Julian had taken all the credit at his partner meetings. On Friday morning, I sent identical emails to all 3 CEOs. The message was simple: evidence of fund misallocation affecting your company's financials. Urgent board review recommended. Documentation attached. By 9:30 a.m., my phone was ringing off the hook. Michael Chen from Pinnacle Tech was the first to call. Amelia, these documents. Is this real? Julian's been billing his personal expenses to our operating budget? Every receipt is authenticated and dated, I told him calmly. Your unusually high consulting fees last quarter actually paid for his stays at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. The emergency board meeting at Meridian Equity was convened at 11 a.m. I wasn't there, but Michael Chen called me from a bathroom stall during a break, his voice a hushed whisper. It's absolute chaos, he said. The limited partners are losing their minds. Someone just calculated that Julian misappropriated $3.2 million over the last 18 months. They're talking about pressing criminal charges themselves. By 3 p.m., it was over. Julian was placed on indefinite leave. His equity stake was frozen pending the outcome of the investigation, and his access to the company was immediately revoked. The security footage that leaked later showed him packing his personal belongings into a cardboard box while 2 security guards stood over him, making sure he didn't take any company files. The grand corner office where he had thrown his laptop in a fit of rage was now the scene of his professional funeral. His assistant, apparently, refused to even make eye contact as he was escorted out. That evening, Clara called me. She was sobbing, but these were different tears. They were tears of relief mixed with a healthy dose of anger. I confronted Ethan with everything, she said, her voice steadier than I'd expected. At first, he denied it all, said I was being paranoid and that I just didn't understand startup metrics. Then I showed him the evidence you helped me compile. She described how Ethan had completely crumbled, falling to his knees in their shared apartment, admitting that he had inflated Veridata's user numbers by over 90%. The 2 million users were mostly bots he'd bought from a developer in Romania. The banking partnerships were just draft proposals. The entire company was a house of cards, designed to secure one last round of funding before it all came crashing down. He kept saying he could make it right, Clara continued, her voice laced with disgust. As if you can just fix fraud with good intentions. He actually suggested we get married immediately so that I couldn't be forced to testify against him. She had ended the engagement with a group text to their circle of friends, a brutal but effective way to avoid individual confrontations. The message was short. "The wedding is off. Please do not contact me again." Her phone had immediately blown up with messages, but she had blocked every number. "You saved me," she said quietly. "You saved me from becoming a federal defendant's wife, from visiting him in prison, from having all my assets seized because of his crimes." At 2 a.m., my doorbell camera sent an alert to my phone. It was Julian, standing on my porch, swaying slightly. His expensive suit was wrinkled and stained, his tie pulled loose. He looked exactly like what he was, a man whose entire world had collapsed in less than a week. "Amelia!" he shouted loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "Open the door! We need to talk!" I watched on the camera feed as he alternated between pounding on the door and leaning against it for support. The recording would be perfect for the restraining order Catherine was filing in the morning. "I know you're in there watching," he slurred, looking directly into the camera lens. "You think you've won? I'll destroy your little company. I'll tell everyone what you really are. What I really was. A woman who had saved his family's legacy, supported his career, and built her own success in spite of his constant dismissal. The threat might have intimidated me once. Now it was just the pathetic noise of a man who had lost all his power. We can work this out," he continued, his tone shifting to desperate pleading. "It was just a joke, Amelia. The name tag. It was all Mom's idea. You know I love you. Love." He threw the word around as if it meant something, as if it could erase the help badge, the missing chair, and his laughter as I stood there, utterly alone. Through the camera, I watched him slide down the steps and sit with his head in his hands, the mighty Julian Sterling, reduced to a drunken beggar on the doorstep of the woman he had tried to humiliate. After 20 minutes, he finally gave up and stumbled toward an Uber that was charged to the credit card I had not yet removed my name from. I would fix that in the morning, right after filing the restraining order. For now, I had 20 minutes of recorded evidence of harassment, threats, and trespassing. Saturday afternoon brought the most poetic revelation of all. David had been tracking the Sterling family's financial implosion through his network of contacts. What he found out about Eleanor's current situation was beyond anything I could have imagined. "She's working as a receptionist," he told me over coffee in my home office, at a dental practice in a suburb outside the city. $15 an hour plus benefits. The woman who had declared me just staff was now, quite literally, staff. The woman who had said food is for family was probably packing a lunch to save money. The woman who measured human worth in designer labels and trust fund balances was now taking public transportation because her Land Rover had been repossessed on Thursday. "She's living in a one-bedroom apartment near the train station," David continued, showing me the property records on his tablet. $1,200 a month. Her Beacon Hill mansion was seized yesterday to cover the fraud penalties. I pictured Eleanor sitting behind a reception desk, scheduling appointments for people she once would have considered beneath her, answering phones with the same voice that had announced to a room of 300 people that I was the housekeeper, filing insurance forms for the kind of middle-class families she used to disdain. Apparently, the other receptionists have no idea who she used to be, David added. She's going by Ellie now, Ellie Whitmore. Told them she's divorced and starting over. Starting over at 62, with nothing but an hourly wage and a benefits package she desperately needed for health insurance. The same age when her former friends were planning Mediterranean cruises and complaining about estate taxes, something she would never have to worry about again. That evening, I stood in my townhouse, looking at the remnants of my old life. Julian's belongings still took up half the closet. Suits that would soon be sold to pay his legal fees, watches that would be seized as fraudulently purchased assets, the cufflinks I'd given him for our anniversary that he'd never worn because they weren't expensive enough. On my desk sat the final contract for the Arboretum Hall, waiting for my signature. Beside it lay the help badge, a permanent reminder of the moment they had shown me their true selves. In their attempt to diminish me, they had set me free. I was no longer the supportive wife making herself smaller for her husband's fragile ego. I was a woman capable of the systematic, legal, and complete dismantling of those who had mistaken her kindness for weakness. The Sterling family empire hadn't just fallen. It had been methodically demolished, brick by brick, until nothing remained but rubble and regret. I signed the final papers for the Arboretum Hall on a Monday morning that felt like the first day of my new life. The venue was now mine. Every marble column, every crystal chandelier, every square inch of the space where they had tried to erase me. David had scheduled a press conference for Wednesday at 2 p.m., the exact time Eleanor's charity gala committee was supposed to be having its final planning meeting. The main ballroom looked different in the daylight, less intimidating. I stood at a podium, looking out at the assembled reporters, local business owners, and community leaders. The same room where I had been denied a chair now held 50 people who had come to hear my vision for its future. The Arboretum Hall will now operate under a new set of principles, I announced, my voice steady and clear. Effective immediately, we are eliminating all hierarchical seating arrangements and any demeaning identification practices. Every guest, regardless of their bank account or bloodline, will be treated with equal dignity and respect. I held up a sample of our new name badges, simple, elegant, with just a name. No one would ever be labeled as the help, or staff, or anything else designed to make them feel small. Additionally, I continued, we are launching the Community Celebration Initiative. Once a month, the Arboretum Hall will be available, free of charge, for immigrant families to celebrate their milestones, weddings, graduations, citizenship ceremonies, because everyone deserves a beautiful space for their most important moments, not just those born into privilege. A reporter from the Boston Globe raised her hand. Mrs. Sterling, what about the existing bookings? We understand there was a major charity gala scheduled here for December. All existing contracts will be honored, provided they adhere to our new policies, I said carefully. However, any event that cannot comply with our standards of equal treatment will need to find an alternative venue. We have already issued full refunds where necessary. Eleanor's gala, the pinnacle of her social calendar, was officially canceled. Her deposit had been returned that morning with a polite note explaining that the Arboretum Hall could no longer host events that practiced social stratification. The woman who had orchestrated my humiliation would have to find somewhere else to pretend she still mattered. As the press conference ended, my phone buzzed. It was Catherine Rourke. The federal investigation had released its initial findings. Julian's crimes were even worse than I had documented. $3.2 million embezzled over 18 months, Catherine explained. Systematically stolen from investors who had trusted him with their retirement funds and college savings. They're seizing everything, Amelia. The townhouse goes to auction next month. Both Porsches, the boat he kept in the harbor, even his watch collection. That Patek Philippe he loved to show off? It was bought with stolen money. The townhouse where I had made his coffee, where I had pressed his shirts while he plotted against me, would be sold to the highest bidder. His precious vintage Porsche, which he spent weekends polishing while I was saving failing businesses, would end up in someone else's garage. Every symbol of his supposed success was being stripped away, revealing the fraud underneath. His legal defense is costing him a fortune, Catherine continued. The family trust his grandfather set up is almost gone. There won't be anything left for appeals. That afternoon, I received an unexpected email from Helena Morrison, a senior partner at Meridian Equity. She wanted to meet privately at a quiet coffee shop far from the financial district. I almost said no, but curiosity got the better of me. Helena looked older than she had at the party, the stress evident around her eyes. She stood up when I arrived, a gesture of respect she would never have offered me 2 weeks ago. I owe you an apology, she said, without any preamble. I suspected Julian was misallocating funds 6 months ago. Small things, nothing I could prove. I should have investigated more thoroughly. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was the contact information for 12 CEOs in her network, all running companies that desperately needed restructuring expertise. These executives value integrity, she said. They need someone who can save their businesses without destroying their employees' lives. I've already made the introductions. They're expecting your call. 3 of those calls turned into immediate contracts, worth over 7 figures each. Within a week, Apex Strategy had more work than we could handle. I had to hire 6 new consultants just to manage the overflow. We were no longer my little business. We were Boston's premier restructuring firm, sought after by companies that wanted honest solutions, not financial tricks. The following Friday, I attended the Boston Women in Business Conference. I wasn't scheduled to speak. I was just there to network and recruit. Then the moderator announced a surprise speaker for the session on professional integrity. Clara walked onto the stage, dressed in a simple black suit, looking nothing like the girl who had cried in my kitchen. She owned the podium. 2 months ago, I was planning a wedding to a man who was committing federal fraud, she began, her voice ringing with newfound confidence. I would have married him, tied my future to his crimes, if not for one person who cared enough to tell me the truth. She looked directly at me in the 3rd row. Amelia Sterling saved me from becoming collateral damage in someone else's lies. While my own family was plotting a public humiliation against her, she was quietly protecting me from a life-altering mistake. The audience of 500 professional women listened in rapt attention as Clara described discovering Ethan's fraud, selling her engagement ring, and using the money to fund her MBA at MIT's Sloan School of Management. Real family, she said, her voice strong, protects you. Real family tells you hard truths. Real family stands up for you when the world tries to make you small. Amelia taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about choosing to protect people, even when they're connected to those who have hurt you. The applause was deafening. Women all over the auditorium were on their feet. I hadn't wanted public vindication, but sitting there, watching Clara claim her own power, I felt something in my chest finally release. After the conference, Clara found me in the lobby. She hugged me, then pulled out her laptop. "Look," she said, pointing to an email. "I got accepted into the Dean's Fellowship program. Full scholarship." It was based on my essay about recognizing and escaping financial fraud. They want me to help develop a new curriculum on business ethics. The girl who was supposed to marry for status was now building a career on substance. The sister who had stood by while I was shamed had become the only family worth having. That evening, I stood alone in the main ballroom of the Arboretum Hall. The maintenance staff was setting up for the next day's event, a citizenship ceremony for 30 immigrant families who would celebrate in the same space where I had been told I wasn't family enough for a chair. The bitter irony had transformed into something much sweeter, something that tasted like justice. A year to the day had passed since the engagement party. Tonight, I was hosting my own gathering in this very room, but this time every chair was filled with people who understood that a person's worth is not defined by their last name. David arrived first, carrying a bottle of wine from Giuseppe's private cellar. The pizzeria owner I had saved 3 years ago had insisted. Catherine Rourke came next, fresh from a court victory. Marco, from La Stella, brought a homemade tiramisu, and then Clara walked in. No longer a broken girl, but a confident woman who carried herself with an easy grace. We sat at a round table. No head, no hierarchy, just equals sharing a meal. The laughter was real, born from shared struggles and mutual respect. To resilience, David said, raising his glass, and to Amelia, who showed us all that being dismissed as just staff can be the first step to becoming indispensable. After dinner, I drove to my new office, a loft space in a renovated warehouse. On the wall, between my MBA diploma and the framed first check from Giuseppe's Pizzeria, hung the name tag. I had had it professionally mounted under museum-quality glass. The elegant script was still perfectly clear: Amelia, the help. Every client who sat across from my desk saw it. And when they asked, I told them the story. I told them how the badge meant to define me had actually freed me, how the greatest strength often comes from being underestimated. It reminds me, I would tell them, that your current position does not define your future potential. The next morning, Catherine called with one last update. Julian had sent a letter through his public defender. "Dear Amelia," Catherine read, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I'm writing from Milwaukee. I've taken a junior analyst position. I'm living with my parents in my childhood bedroom. It's humbling." The letter was 2 pages of self-pity and revisionist history. He claimed the name tag was a misunderstanding, that his mother had acted alone. He begged me to consider dropping the charges, as if the federal government cared about my forgiveness. "How should I respond?" Catherine asked. "One word," I said, "number." That evening, I stood in my penthouse apartment, watching the sunrise over the city. My laptop was open to the expansion plans for Apex Strategies' new Detroit office. My phone buzzed with a text from Clara. It was a photo from her ethics class, where she was teaching a case study on fraud in personal relationships. Using our story to help others, she wrote, "Hope that's okay." I smiled. "Our story belongs to you, too." I typed back, "Teach them well." Outside, Boston was waking up. Somewhere, Ellie was getting ready for another day of answering phones. Somewhere, Julian was living in his childhood bedroom. And here, I was planning the next phase of a business built on the principle that everyone deserves a second chance, except for those who refuse to see they did anything wrong. The name tag was meant to put me in my place, and it did. My place wasn't at their table, begging for scraps of acceptance. My place was here, building something that mattered, surrounded by people who saw my worth without needing a name tag to spell it out. The housekeeper had indeed cleaned house, sweeping away everything that no longer served a purpose and building something stronger in its place. If this story of calculated revenge left you speechless, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Amelia placed her wedding ring on that empty table, turning their public humiliation into her declaration of independence. What was your favorite moment of justice? Drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell to catch more gripping stories of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate triumph. End of story.